All right, so now that you've written your thesis, or you've gotten as much of it as you could done, I'd like you to take a few minutes to listen to this um, mini lecture that tells you what happens as the Cold War heats up between 1949 or so and 1960. Once again, we're looking at the consequences of the U.S. policy of containment. How does containment, this policy that is proposed under Truman and then becomes the official policy of every American administration throughout the Cold War, how does this policy of containment affect American foreign policy in the 1950s and 1960s? Again, the nuclear arms race is certainly a big part of this. And here you see all the many nuclear warheads that both the U.S. and the Soviet Union kind of amass in the 1950s. That is definitely a big part of the policy of containment. The U.S. Believes that having more nuclear weapons than the Soviet Union will um, will lead to a successful effort to encircle the Soviet Union and prevent them from becoming too influential in the around the world. Containment policy, though, um, leads Americans to become quite anxious about this development in 1949. After many years of civil war in 1949, the communists in China um, defeat Mao Zedong and the nationalists and take over and become the official government of China. In other words, China, quote unquote, falls to the communists in 1949. And American leaders, like Truman and many people in his administration, as well as people in Congress, begin to freak out. Who lost China is the big question. Why was this allowed to happen? How could we, in just a few years of the Cold War, allow the communists, the global movement, to install communist regimes around the world? How can we allow them this kind of victory? Is the big question that is being asked by people. And they vow never to allow it to happen again. So the fall of China to communism becomes one of the big calls to action for American policymakers, especially foreign policymakers, and military advisors in the 1950s and 1960s. And it is definitely the reason why the United States was so adamant about its role in the Korean War. The Korean War began in 1950 and ended in 1953, and it goes something like this. North Korea and South Korea were split up after World War II. North Korea was controlled and influenced by communists, the Soviet Union, and then China. South Korea was under the influence of the United States and its allies. In 1950, the North Korean army invades South Korea, crossing the 38th parallel, and very quickly winning victories all around South Korea. United States. So here you see the kind of like the trajectory of the war. The North Koreans attack. They get all the way down to to Busan, or close to Busan, the last kind of major city left, and then the United States decides, with the help of some allies, but really with the U.S. as the major contributor of forces, along with the United Nations, or in cooperation with the United Nations, invades South Korea in order to push back the North Koreans. And they do a really good job of pushing back the North Koreans all the way up here. But then, with the help of China, the North Koreans once again repel the American forces and the South Korean forces and push them all the way back to this line here, the 38th parallel. And that's pretty much where the war ends up. As a result of the war, North Korea and South Korea are now permanently become two different countries. One democratic, more or less democratic, although not always and not consistently, country allied and capitalist country allied with the United States and the West, and one a communist country that's close with China and with the Soviet Union. Um, at the end of the war, which never, by the way, officially ended. There was no treaty, but rather an armistice to just declare an end to hostilities. Eisenhower takes over towards the end of the Korean War, and Eisenhower was the hero of World War II. He was the supreme commander of the Allied forces. He was a household name in the United States and around the world. And he decides to run for president in 1952 as a Republican and wins. And the 50s, the 1950s, pretty much becomes the Eisenhower era. Eisenhower continues the containment policy. He ends the Korean. He leads to the end of the Korean War, but then he also expands American efforts to contain communism anywhere by looking at the Third World. Eisenhower is concerned, as are many American policymakers, about anti-colonial and radical movements in the 1950s, meaning like India, for example, which was fighting against the British to achieve its independence. Pakistan, same thing. Indonesia, Ghana, a number of African and Asian countries were fighting to become free of European colonialism. Well, Eisenhower and many in the U.S. were concerned that once they became free, these so-called third world countries would turn to communism, and he certainly wanted to avoid that. So Eisenhower used, in part, aside from economic aid and things like that, covert action. The Central Intelligence Agency in the 1950s becomes a notorious security agency. They're a spy agency, that's their primary purpose. But the CIA begins to act all over the world in secretive ways, to undermine any efforts around the world in any country to turn to communism. So, for example, in Iran in 1953, the CIA led an effort to overthrow the democratically elected government of Iran. Now, the reason they overthrew them was because the new prime minister of Iran began talking about perhaps nationalizing or taking over Western oil fields. That is, oil fields that had been purchased by British Petroleum, so BP, British company, and some American companies as well. And oil had become, as you know, a very important commodity during this time. The CIA was worried about that and worried that it might lose its influence in Iran, and so it led to the overthrow of this government and replaced the government with the Shah. The Shah was sort of like a king who had been removed some years before. The Shah turned out to be quite a jerk for many decades, but the one thing that the United States knew was that the Shah was friendly to the U.S., and that's what really mattered. So the U.S. continued to maintain the Shah's power for several decades. In Guatemala, the United States CIA led to an overthrow of the government of Guatemala because it was too left-leaning. It was kind of leaning towards socialism, and the U.S. was worried that it might become communist. In the Philippines, the United States helped to install a dictator because the dictator was anti-communist, and Americans were worried about communism having too much influence there. And there's a long list of things the U.S. did using the CIA covertly, secretly, to undermine governments all around the world in order to make sure that they didn't turn to communism, or that the Communist Party didn't have, or the Soviets didn't have, couldn't successfully influence those countries. Eisenhower also was very much focused on the Middle East, especially. Aside from Iran, Eisenhower, in general, vowed that anytime a Middle Eastern country is threatened by communism, the United States would intervene. This became the Eisenhower Doctrine, the main purpose of which, of course, was to protect oil resources. So another example of this is the fact that Eisenhower sent 15,000 U.S. troops to Lebanon in 1958 in order to protect American interests there. The containment policy leads Americans to get involved in Vietnam. The French, Vietnam was a French colony up to 1954, and in 1954, the French lose control of what it called Indochine to an insurgency by leftist guerrillas there, led by this guy, Ho Chi Minh. In 1954, they drive the French out. Vietnam is divided in half as a result of a peace treaty. The North becomes the communist side. The South becomes the non-communist side, just like in Korea. The U.S. sends aid and military advisors to the South because they were worried that the South was being threatened by communists there. And the U.S. Began a very long history of involvement in Vietnam from that point on. And then finally, in 1959, the Cuban government is overthrown by a leftist military insurgency led by Fidel Castro. Cuba was controlled by a dictator before that, Fulgencio Batista. Batista was a close ally of the United States, anti-communist. And as long as he was anti-communist, the United States was okay with him, even though he was a pretty brutal dictator. Which is why in Cuba there arose an insurgency to topple this dictator. Castro became the figurehead of the leader of this insurgency, although it was multifaceted. And it's successful. In 1959, Castro leads to the successful overthrow of this dictator. And he also declares that he is a socialist. The United States did not want a socialist government only 90 miles away from Florida, from the U.S. and Cuba. So the Eisenhower administration begins to plan an invasion of Cuba by immigrants from Cuba who would be trained by the CIA. And he leaves office in 1959. His successor, John F. Kennedy, would find out about these plans and would then carry out the invasion known as the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. It failed, and Cuba will remain a communist country for many decades hence. Thence? No? Yes. Anyway, that is all. That is the policy of containment all the way until 1960 and the way it influenced American policy internationally. Thank you, guys.